Hello and welcome. My name is Sanic, and today we're going to explore what it was really like to be poor in the Middle Ages. Not the romantic version filled with castles and noble feasts, but the quiet, ordinary reality experienced by the vast majority of people who lived during this time. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment telling me what time you're watching this. I always enjoy seeing when these stories become part of your day or night. It's always fascinating to see how people from all over the world come together through these stories. Now, get comfortable, let the pace slow down, and allow yourself to drift into a calmer state as we begin. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they often picture kings, knights, and grand stone castles rising above the countryside. What they rarely imagine is the daily life of the poor, despite the fact that poverty was the normal condition for most medieval people. If you were born in the Middle Ages, there was a very high chance that you would live your entire life with little money, limited food, few possessions, and almost no control over your circumstances. Poverty was not an exception to the system. It was the system. To be poor in the Middle Ages did not simply mean having less than others. It meant living close to hunger at all times, working physically demanding jobs from childhood until death, and knowing that a single bad harvest, illness, or injury could end your life or the lives of those you loved. There were no safety nets, no social programs, and no reliable institutions designed to protect the poor from disaster. Survival depended on constant labor, community tolerance, and a great deal of luck. Most poor people were born into poverty and remained there until they died. Social mobility was extremely limited, and the idea of improving your station in life through hard work alone was largely a myth. Your position was usually determined at birth by your family, your village, and the land you were tied to. If your parents were poor laborers or peasants, you would almost certainly become one as well. From an early age, poor children were expected to contribute to survival. Childhood, as we understand it today, barely existed. By the age of 6 or 7, many children were already helping with farm work, carrying water, tending animals, gathering firewood, or assisting with household tasks. By their early teens, they were performing heavy labor alongside adults. Education was rare, and for most poor families, teaching a child to read or write was far less important than teaching them how to work. Food was the central concern of daily life. Poor medieval families lived according to the rhythm of meals, and those meals were often simple, repetitive, and insufficient. Bread was the foundation of the diet, usually made from barley, rye, or oats rather than wheat, which was more expensive and associated with wealth. This bread was coarse, dense, and often stale, but it provided the calories needed to survive long days of physical labor. Alongside bread, poor people ate pottage, a thick stew made by boiling grains, vegetables, and whatever else was available. This might include onions, cabbage, leeks, beans, or peas, simmered for hours over an open fire. Meat was rare and usually reserved for special occasions, religious holidays, or times when an animal could no longer work. When meat was eaten, it was often preserved through salting or smoking, making it tough and extremely salty. Fresh fruit and vegetables were seasonal and unpredictable. During winter, diets became even more limited, and many people survived on stored grains and preserved foods that had lost much of their nutritional value. Malnutrition was common, even among those who technically had enough calories to eat. Vitamin deficiencies weakened immune systems, slowed healing, and made even minor illnesses dangerous. Hunger was not constant for everyone, but it was always a possibility. A poor harvest caused by bad weather, disease, or war could lead to famine, and famines were recurring features of medieval life. During these periods, People ate whatever they could find. Bark was stripped from trees, grass was boiled into thin soups, and animals normally considered inedible were consumed. Starvation deaths were not rare, and many more people died from diseases made worse by weakened bodies. Housing for the poor was basic and uncomfortable. Most lived in small wooden huts or simple stone structures with dirt floors. These homes were poorly insulated and offered little protection from cold, heat, or dampness. Roofs were often made of thatch, which leaked when it rained and harbored insects and rodents. Smoke from indoor fires filled the living space, irritating lungs and eyes, especially during winter when ventilation was limited. Furniture was minimal. A poor household might own a table, a few stools, and straw-filled sleeping mats rather than proper beds. Entire families often slept in the same room, sometimes in the same bed, not out of affection, but necessity. Privacy was virtually non existent, and illness spread easily in these close quarters. Clothing reflected poverty just as clearly as food and housing. Poor people typically owned only one or two sets of clothes, made from rough wool or linen. These garments were uncomfortable, heavy, and rarely washed, not because people did not care about cleanliness, but because water, soap, and time were valuable resources. Clothing was patched repeatedly and worn until it could no longer hold together. Shoes, if owned at all, were simple and poorly made. Many people went barefoot during warmer months, exposing their feet to injury and infection. During winter, inadequate footwear contributed to frostbite and chronic pain. Clothing offered little protection against weather, and exposure was a constant threat. Work dominated nearly every waking hour. Poor medieval people worked from sunrise to sunset, with short breaks dictated by daylight rather than comfort. Farming was the most common occupation, and it required constant physical effort. Plowing, planting, harvesting, and caring for animals involved repetitive strain that wore bodies down quickly. Tools were heavy, inefficient, and often dangerous. Those who did not farm might work as laborers, servants, or craftsmen's assistants. These jobs were unstable and poorly paid. Employment depended on seasons, local demand, and the favor of those in power. Losing work could quickly lead to hunger, homelessness, or forced migration in search of survival. Illness was an ever-present danger. Medical knowledge was limited, and professional doctors were rare and expensive. Most poor people relied on folk remedies, herbal treatments, and prayers. Some treatments helped, others did nothing, and some caused harm. Infections that are easily treated today often proved fatal, and injuries that prevented someone from working could mean starvation. Life expectancy was low, especially for the poor. Many did not survive childhood, and those who did often showed signs of physical aging by their 30s. Chronic pain, dental problems, joint damage, and untreated injuries were common. Old age, when reached, was often accompanied by disability and dependence on family or charity. Religion played a complex role in the lives of the poor. The church offered spiritual comfort and explanations for suffering, teaching that poverty could be virtuous and that hardship in this life might be rewarded in the next. At the same time, religious institutions provided limited charity, such as food for the hungry or care for the sick, though resources were never sufficient to meet demand. Being poor also meant having little legal power. Laws were written by and for the wealthy, and justice was often uneven. Fines were common punishments, which meant that the poor suffered more severely for the same offenses. A small crime could result in ruin, while wealthier individuals could often pay their way out of trouble. Despite all this, poor medieval people were not constantly miserable. They formed strong community bonds, shared resources when possible, and found moments of joy in festivals, religious celebrations, storytelling, and simple companionship. These moments did not erase hardship, but they made life bearable. Poverty in the Middle Ages was not dramatic or heroic. It was quiet, exhausting, and relentless. It shaped every aspect of daily life, from what people ate to how they slept, worked, and thought about the future. For most, survival was not about long term plans or dreams, but about making it through the next day. And this was only the beginning. To understand what it meant to be poor in the Middle Ages, you have to understand work, because work was not just part of life, it was life itself. For the poor, nearly every waking hour was shaped by labor, and rest was not something earned or scheduled, but something that happened only when the body could no longer continue. The idea of a balanced life with clear boundaries between work and personal time simply did not exist. Most poor people worked the land in some form. Farming was the backbone of medieval society, and peasants provided the food that sustained everyone else. This work was seasonal but relentless, with different tasks filling every month of the year. There was always something that needed to be done, and falling behind could mean hunger or punishment. In spring, fields had to be prepared after months of cold and damp. The soil was heavy and difficult to turn, especially with simple wooden plows pulled by animals that were often as exhausted as the people guiding them. Planting seeds required careful timing, as planting too early or too late could ruin an entire harvest. Summer brought long days and intense physical strain. Crops needed constant attention, weeds had to be pulled by hand, and animals required feeding, watering, and protection. Work often began at sunrise and continued until the light faded, with only short pauses to eat coarse meals in the fields. Harvest season was the most demanding time of all. Every available hand, including children and the elderly, was needed to gather crops before weather or rot destroyed them. The work was urgent and exhausting, and mistakes could not be undone. A failed harvest did not simply mean inconvenience, it meant starvation. Winter did not bring rest, it brought different kinds of labor. Tools had to be repaired, animals cared for, grain protected from damp and pests, and fuel gathered for fires. The cold made every task harder, and hunger was most severe during these months when stored food ran low. For many poor people, farming was not done for themselves alone. They worked land owned by a lord and were required to give a portion of their crops as rent or tax. This obligation existed regardless of how much they harvested. Even in years of scarcity, dues were expected, leaving peasants with even less to survive on. Failure to meet these obligations could result in fines, loss of land, or physical punishment. The poor did not own the ground they worked, and this lack of ownership meant constant vulnerability. A bad year could push a family into permanent ruin. Not all poor people were farmers, but other forms of work were rarely easier. Laborers worked wherever hands were needed, hauling goods, digging ditches, repairing roads, or assisting craftsmen. These jobs were unstable and poorly paid, and work could disappear without warning. Craft apprenticeships offered some opportunity, but they were difficult to secure and often required family connections or fees that poor families could not afford. Even apprentices worked long hours for little reward, living under strict control and discipline. Servants worked in wealthier households, performing cooking, cleaning, and maintenance. While servants often received food and shelter, they had little freedom and could be dismissed at any time. Their lives were shaped by obedience rather than choice. Work was physically punishing, tools were heavy and inefficient, and repetitive strain damaged bodies quickly. Back injuries, joint pain, and permanent deformities were common even among young workers. There was no concept of workplace safety, and injuries were accepted as inevitable. A broken leg or damaged hand could end a person's ability to work. Without savings or support, this often meant hunger or reliance on charity. Many people who could no longer work became beggars, surviving only through the goodwill of others. Children worked almost as soon as they were physically capable. Childhood was not a protected stage of life, but a gradual introduction into labor. Children carried water, watched animals, gathered firewood, and assisted in fields long before adolescence. By their early teens, children were expected to perform adult-level work. This early labor shaped their bodies permanently, often resulting in stunted growth and chronic pain later in life. Education, when available, was brief and secondary to survival. Women's labor was constant and undervalued. In addition to working in fields when needed, women were responsible for cooking, cleaning, childcare, food preservation, and textile production. These tasks were time-consuming and physically demanding, leaving little opportunity for rest. Spinning wool, weaving cloth, baking bread, and brewing ale were essential household tasks, not hobbies. Mistakes could mean wasted resources that could not be replaced. Women's work rarely stopped, even during pregnancy or illness. Pregnancy did not excuse women from labor. Many worked until childbirth and returned to work shortly afterward. This strain contributed to high maternal mortality rates, especially among the poor who lacked adequate nutrition and care. Time itself was experienced differently by the poor. Without clocks or strict schedules, work followed daylight and seasons rather than hours and minutes. However, this did not mean life was relaxed. Tasks expanded to fill all available time. Rest was brief and often uncomfortable. Meals were simple and eaten quickly. Sleep was shallow, interrupted by cold, noise, and physical pain. The body was expected to recover just enough to work again the next day. Despite this relentless labor, many poor people struggled to produce enough to survive. Wages were low, rents were high, and taxes were unavoidable. Economic security was rare, and most families lived one failed harvest away from disaster. Work did not guarantee stability, it only delayed collapse. This constant pressure shaped the mindset of the poor, encouraging endurance rather than hope, and practicality rather than ambition. Yet, within this harsh system, people adapted. They shared tools, helped neighbors during peak labor seasons, and relied on community cooperation to survive. Mutual aid was not idealistic, but necessary. Barn raisings, shared harvests, and communal repairs allowed poor communities to accomplish tasks impossible for individuals. These moments of cooperation offered brief relief from isolation and exhaustion. Still, the weight of labor never truly lifted. Work defined identity, value, and survival. To be unable to work was to risk becoming invisible, unwanted, or abandoned. For the poor in the Middle Ages, life was not divided into meaningful chapters or long-term goals. It was divided into days of labor, each one resembling the last, each one demanding everything the body could give. And even with all this effort, survival was never guaranteed. For the poor in the Middle Ages, food was not about enjoyment, variety, or choice. It was about survival. Every day was shaped by the question of whether there would be enough to eat, not just today, but tomorrow and the day after that. Hunger was not always visible, but it was always present in the background of daily life. Most poor families ate only 1 or 2 meals a day. These meals were simple, repetitive, and designed to stretch limited resources as far as possible. The idea of eating for pleasure would have seemed strange to people who measured food by how long it could keep them working. Bread formed the foundation of the medieval poor diet. This bread was rarely the white wheat bread associated with wealth. Instead, It was made from barley, rye, oats, or mixed grains, resulting in dense, dark loaves that were heavy in the stomach but slow to spoil. Fresh bread was a luxury, and most people ate it stale or hardened. Alongside bread, pottage was the most common meal. Pottage was a thick stew made by boiling whatever ingredients were available in a single pot. Vegetables, grains, and occasionally small scraps of meat were cooked together for hours, creating a filling but bland dish that could be eaten over several days. Meat was rare for the poor. Animals were valuable as sources of labor, milk, wool, or eggs, and slaughtering one meant losing long term resources. When meat was eaten, it was often from animals that had died naturally or were no longer useful. Preservation through salting or smoking made meat tough and extremely salty. Fish provided an alternative protein, especially in areas near rivers or the coast. Dried or salted fish was common, particularly during religious fast days when meat was forbidden. These fasting rules applied to everyone, but they affected the poor more severely, limiting already scarce options. Fresh fruits and vegetables depended entirely on the season. During warmer months, people ate what they could grow or gather. In winter, diets narrowed drastically. Stored grains, dried legumes, and preserved vegetables became the primary food sources, and nutritional deficiencies grew more severe. Malnutrition was widespread, even among those who appeared to eat regularly. Lack of vitamins weakened immune systems, slowed healing, and left bodies vulnerable to infection. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was not uncommon during long winters without fresh produce. Food storage was a constant challenge. Grain had to be kept dry and protected from pests. Rats, mice, and insects consumed significant portions of stored food, and contamination was often unavoidable. Poor families accepted this as part of life, removing what they could and eating the rest. Cooking was labor intensive and inefficient. Meals were prepared over open hearths or simple stoves that required constant fuel. Gathering firewood was time consuming, and in areas where wood was scarce, people burned dried animal dung or peat instead. Water quality affected food safety. Clean water was not guaranteed, and many people drank from the same sources used for washing and livestock. This led to frequent outbreaks of waterborne diseases, further weakening already malnourished bodies. Hunger became most severe during times of famine. Medieval Europe experienced repeated famines caused by bad weather, crop disease, war, or disruption of trade. During these periods, even normally resilient families struggled to survive. In famine conditions, people ate whatever they could find. Bark was stripped from trees, roots were dug from frozen ground, and grass was boiled into thin soups. Pets and working animals were consumed, followed by animals normally considered inedible. Starvation rarely killed quickly. It weakened people first, making them susceptible to disease. Many died not directly from hunger, but from illnesses their bodies could no longer resist. Children suffered the most. Hunger during childhood led to stunted growth, weakened bones, and shortened lifespans. Many children did not survive repeated periods of scarcity. Charity existed, but it was limited. Churches and monasteries distributed food when possible, especially during religious holidays. However, resources were never sufficient to meet demand, and aid was often conditional. Begging was common and socially visible. Beggars gathered near churches, marketplaces, and roads, hoping for scraps or coins. Some were disabled, elderly, or orphaned. Others were simply victims of bad luck. Being forced to beg carried shame, but survival outweighed pride. Medieval society accepted begging as part of the social order, though beggars were often distrusted and blamed for their condition. Food preparation involved constant compromise. Portions were small, meals were stretched, and leftovers were reused repeatedly. Waste was unthinkable. Even breadcrumbs were saved and reused. Despite hunger, food carried social meaning. Shared meals during festivals, weddings, and religious celebrations provided rare moments of abundance. These occasions stood out sharply against daily scarcity. Alcohol, particularly ale, was consumed regularly. Weak ale was safer than water and provided calories. Children drank it as well, as its alcohol content was low. Ale was often more reliable than clean water. Cooking skills were essential survival tools. Knowing how to stretch ingredients, preserve food, and make use of scraps could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. Hunger shaped behavior and values. It encouraged caution, thrift, and constant awareness of resources. People learned not to waste, not to expect, and not to rely on abundance. For the poor, eating was never automatic. It required planning, labor, and constant vigilance. Every meal represented success in a system designed to provide as little margin as possible. And even with all this effort, food security remained fragile. For the poor in the Middle Ages, comfort was not something expected from daily life. Shelter and clothing existed to provide the most basic protection from the environment and little more. Warmth, dryness, and privacy were uncertain luxuries rather than guaranteed conditions. Most poor families lived in small homes constructed from whatever materials were locally available. In rural areas, houses were often made of wood, mud, straw, and clay, while in some regions stone was used when it could be gathered cheaply. These buildings were simple, quickly built, and rarely designed to last more than a generation. Floors were usually bare earth. Dirt floors absorbed moisture, attracted insects, and became muddy in wet weather. Straw or rushes were sometimes spread across the ground to provide minimal insulation, but these coverings quickly became dirty and had to be replaced. Roofs were typically made of thatch, constructed from dried grass or reeds. Thatch provided some insulation, but required constant maintenance. It leaked during heavy rain and was highly flammable, making fire a constant danger in poor communities. Homes were small and crowded. Entire families lived, worked, cooked, and slept in a single room. Privacy was almost non existent, and personal space was not considered a necessity. Illness spread easily in these close quarters, especially during winter when ventilation was limited. The hearth was the center of the home. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook food. Smoke from the fire often filled the living space, irritating eyes and lungs. Chimneys, when they existed at all, were inefficient, and many homes relied on simple smoke holes in the roof. During winter, homes were cold despite the fire. Fuel was limited, and fires were often kept small to conserve wood or peat. Frost could form inside houses, and breath was visible even indoors. People slept fully clothed to preserve warmth. Summer brought different discomforts. Heat built up inside small homes with poor airflow. Insects thrived, and flies gathered around food and waste. The smell of smoke, animals, and human activity lingered constantly. Furniture was minimal. A poor household might own a rough table, a bench or stool, and a few storage chests. Beds, as we imagine them today, were rare. Most people slept on straw-filled sacks or simple pallets laid directly on the floor. Bedding was shared. Parents and children often slept together, partly for warmth and partly because space was limited. Blankets were heavy, coarse, and often insufficient during cold months. Clothing was another area where poverty was immediately visible. Poor medieval people typically owned only one or two sets of clothing, which had to last for years. Garments were made from rough wool or linen, materials chosen for durability rather than comfort. Clothes were expensive relative to income, making replacement difficult. When garments wore out, they were patched repeatedly until the fabric could no longer hold together. Clothing was repaired until it effectively disintegrated. Washing clothes was labor intensive and infrequent. Soap was costly, and water had to be carried by hand. As a result, clothing was often dirty, stiff, and uncomfortable. This was not due to neglect, but necessity. Footwear was limited or non existent. Shoes were made of simple leather and wore out quickly. Many people went barefoot during warmer months, exposing their feet to injury, infection, and parasites. In winter, inadequate footwear increased the risk of frostbite. Seasonal clothing was rare. Poor families could not afford separate garments for different weather conditions. The same clothes were worn year round, layered in winter, and stripped down as much as modesty allowed in summer. Children often wore hand-me-downs or clothing made from scraps. These garments rarely fit properly, restricting movement or offering poor protection from the elements. Weather shaped daily life inside the home as much as outside. Heavy rain turned floors into mud. Snow blocked doors and collapsed weak roofs. Strong winds forced cold air through gaps in walls. Animals sometimes shared living spaces with people. Chickens, goats, or pigs were brought indoors during harsh weather to protect them from predators or cold. This added warmth, but also increased filth and disease risk. Lighting was limited. Candles were expensive and used sparingly. Most homes relied on firelight, which provided uneven illumination and cast heavy shadows. Darkness shaped routines, pushing people toward sleep soon after sunset. Noise was constant: creaking wood, crackling fires, coughing, and the sounds of animals filled small homes. Silence was rare, and uninterrupted sleep was difficult. Despite these hardships, people adapted. They learned where to sit to avoid drafts, how to layer clothing effectively, and how to make limited fuel last longer. Survival depended on practical knowledge passed down through generations. Home was not a place of relaxation. It was a shelter from the worst of the elements, but rarely a source of comfort. The concept of a cozy living space would have been unfamiliar to most poor medieval people. Clothing and shelter reflected a life lived at the edge of sufficiency. They provided just enough protection to allow work to continue, but never enough to eliminate discomfort. And yet, these conditions were normal. People did not constantly complain about them because there was no alternative to compare them to. Hardship was expected, and endurance was a skill learned early. For the poor in the Middle Ages, illness was not an interruption to life. It was a constant presence, expected and unavoidable. Sickness arrived without warning, lingered without treatment, and often ended lives that might otherwise have continued for years. Medical care as we understand it today did not exist for most people. Trained physicians were rare, expensive, and usually served the wealthy. Poor families relied on folk knowledge, herbal remedies, and prayer, combining experience, tradition, and belief in whatever way seemed most likely to help. Most villages had someone known for healing, often an older woman who understood local plants and simple treatments. Some remedies eased pain or reduced fever, while others had no effect at all. Without scientific understanding of disease, success was unpredictable. Common illnesses included fevers, respiratory infections, digestive disorders, and skin diseases. Poor nutrition weakened immune systems, making recovery slow and uncertain. Minor sicknesses could become deadly when the body lacked strength to heal. Infections were especially dangerous. A small cut or blister could become infected, spreading rapidly without effective treatment. Antibiotics did not exist, and wounds were often cleaned with water that itself carried bacteria. Injuries were common due to heavy labor and unsafe tools. Broken bones, crushed fingers, and deep cuts occurred regularly during farming, construction, and manual work. Many injuries healed poorly, leaving permanent pain or disability. A serious injury often meant the end of a person's ability to work. Without income or support, injured individuals depended entirely on family or charity. Those without either frequently became beggars or died quietly from neglect. Pain management was limited. Alcohol, herbal sedatives, or simple distraction were the primary tools available. Suffering was endured rather than relieved, and people became accustomed to living with chronic pain. Dental health was particularly poor. Tooth decay, infections, and gum disease were widespread. Dentistry typically involved pulling teeth without anesthesia, a painful and dangerous procedure that could itself cause infection or death. Childhood illness was devastating. Many children did not survive early years due to disease, malnutrition, and lack of care. Families expected loss, and it shaped how people viewed childhood and attachment. Pregnancy and childbirth were among the greatest dangers for poor women. Without prenatal care or sterile conditions, complications were common. Many women worked until labor began and returned to work shortly after, increasing risk. Childbirth was usually assisted by midwives or female relatives. While experienced, they lacked tools to handle serious complications. Hemorrhage, infection, and prolonged labor often proved fatal. Men also faced health risks tied to labor. Hernias, joint damage, lung disease from smoke and dust, and untreated infections shortened lives. Few people reached old age without significant physical decline. Mental health was not understood as a medical concern. Depression, anxiety, and trauma were common, especially during famine or after loss, but were often interpreted as spiritual weakness or divine testing. Religious belief played a central role in understanding illness. Disease was often seen as punishment, trial, or part of God's plan. Prayer and confession accompanied treatment, sometimes replacing it entirely. Hospitals existed, but they were rare and not places of healing in the modern sense. They provided shelter and spiritual care rather than effective medical treatment. Many people avoided them unless desperate. Plagues and epidemics periodically swept through communities. Diseases like the Black Death killed millions, but even smaller outbreaks of typhoid, dysentery, and influenza caused widespread suffering among the poor. During outbreaks, the poor were hit hardest. Crowded living conditions, malnutrition, and lack of care increased death rates. Entire families could disappear within weeks. Quarantine was poorly understood and inconsistently applied. Fear often led to isolation, abandonment, or violence rather than organized response. Survival depended largely on chance. Despite this, people adapted to constant risk. They learned to work while sick, ignore pain, and accept physical decline as normal. Endurance became a necessary skill. Old age, when reached, brought new challenges. Without pensions or institutional care, the elderly depended on family or community. Those without support often lived in extreme poverty. Yet illness did not completely dominate life. People continued to work, love, celebrate, and believe. Sickness was part of existence, not its entirety. Health in the Middle Ages was fragile, especially for the poor. Survival depended less on treatment and more on resilience, luck, and the ability to keep working despite pain. And when illness finally ended a life, it was rarely dramatic. It happened quietly, in crowded rooms, surrounded by others who would soon face the same risks. For the poor in the Middle Ages, family was not simply a source of emotional connection. It was an economic unit, a survival system, and a necessity. Every member of the household contributed in some way, and family life was shaped far more by work and obligation than by comfort or affection. Marriage among the poor was often practical rather than romantic. Couples formed households to combine labor, share resources, and increase their chances of survival. Love might develop, but it was rarely the primary consideration when choosing a partner. Homes were crowded, and families were large by necessity rather than choice. Children represented both mouths to feed and future workers. In a world with high child mortality, having many children increased the likelihood that some would survive to adulthood. Infant mortality was devastatingly common. Many children did not survive their first few years due to illness, malnutrition, and unsafe living conditions. Parents learned to temper attachment, not out of cruelty, but as a form of emotional survival. Childhood, as a protected stage of life, barely existed. From a very young age, children were expected to observe, learn, and help. Toddlers followed adults through daily routines, absorbing skills through imitation rather than instruction. By the age of 5 or 6, many children were already performing simple tasks. They carried water, watched younger siblings, gathered fuel, and helped care for animals. These tasks were not considered chores, but essential contributions. As children grew older, responsibilities increased quickly. Boys and girls alike worked in fields, assisted with household labor, or were sent to work for other families as servants or apprentices. Education was rare and secondary to survival. Formal schooling was limited and often inaccessible to the poor. Schools, where they existed, operated sporadically and usually required fees. Most poor children never learned to read or write, relying instead on practical knowledge passed down through generations. Learning occurred through experience. Children learned how to plant crops, repair tools, cook simple meals, preserve food, and recognize signs of illness. These skills were valued far more than abstract knowledge. Play existed, but it was informal and brief. Children played simple games using found objects, sticks, stones, or handmade toys. Play often blended into work, and leisure was rarely separate from responsibility. Parents had limited time and energy for emotional nurturing as we understand it today. Exhaustion, hunger, and stress shaped interactions. Discipline was strict, and physical punishment was widely accepted as necessary. Despite this, families formed deep bonds. Shared hardship created strong connections, and mutual dependence fostered loyalty and cooperation. Survival required trust within the household. Gender roles were clearly defined, but flexible when necessary. Boys and girls often performed similar tasks in childhood, with roles becoming more distinct during adolescence. Survival mattered more than strict social expectations. Teenagers were treated as adults in many respects. By their early teens, they worked full days, contributed economically, and were expected to behave responsibly. Early marriages were common, especially among girls. Young women faced additional challenges. They worked extensively both inside and outside the home, and their value was often tied to labor and fertility. Pregnancy and childbirth began early, increasing health risks. Young men faced dangerous labor, military service, or unstable employment. Injuries and early death were common, and few had the luxury of long-term planning. Extended families often lived close together, sharing resources and labor. Grandparents, when they survived, played roles in childcare and household tasks. However, old age often brought dependence and vulnerability. Orphans were common due to disease, war, and famine. Some were absorbed into other families as servants. Others survived through begging, charity, or institutional care from churches and monasteries, family disputes occurred, but survival limited conflict. There was little room for prolonged disagreement when cooperation was essential for daily life. Death was a constant presence within families. Children witnessed illness, injury, and dying from an early age. Funerals were familiar events, and grief was woven into daily existence. Religious belief shaped family life deeply. Faith provided explanations for suffering and loss, offering comfort when circumstances could not improve. Families prayed together, attended church, and structured time around religious observance. Festivals and holy days offered rare breaks from routine. These occasions brought food, music, and community gatherings. For poor families, they provided moments of relief and shared joy. Despite relentless hardship, families adapted. They shared knowledge, supported one another, and found meaning in continuity rather than progress. Life was not about advancement, but endurance. Growing up poor in the Middle Ages meant learning early that survival depended on effort, cooperation, and acceptance of limits. Dreams were modest, and expectations were shaped by necessity. Family life was not gentle, but it was resilient. Within small homes and limited means, people built lives that continued despite loss, hardship, and uncertainty. For the poor in the Middle Ages, life did not exist only within the household. Survival depended just as much on the surrounding community. Villages, towns, and neighborhoods formed the interconnected systems where cooperation was often necessary, even when resources were scarce. Most poor people lived their entire lives within a small geographic area. Travel was limited, costly, and dangerous, so communities were stable and familiar. Everyone knew one another, not necessarily by choice, but by circumstance. This closeness brought both support and pressure. Neighbors relied on each other for labor, information, and assistance during crises, but they also observed, judged, and remembered. Reputation mattered greatly, especially for the poor. Community cooperation was essential during periods of intense labor. Harvests, construction, and repairs often required many hands. Shared work reduced the individual burden and increased survival chances. Mutual aid was not formalized, but expected, lending tools, sharing food during scarcity, and caring for the sick were part of maintaining social balance. Refusing to help could lead to isolation, which was dangerous for anyone without wealth. At the same time, resources were limited, charity had boundaries, and prolonged dependence was often resented. The poor walked a careful line between seeking help and avoiding becoming a burden. Religion played a central role in community life. The church was not only a spiritual institution, but also a social and organizational center. Church bells structured time, gatherings created shared identity, and religious observance provided rhythm to life. For the poor, religion offered explanation more than relief. Suffering was framed as a test, punishment, or path to salvation. These beliefs did not remove hardship, but they helped people endure it. Church services were among the few regular communal gatherings. They provided the opportunities to see others, exchange news, and participate in shared rituals. Attendance was expected, regardless of personal belief. Charity through the church existed, but was limited. Alms were distributed to the needy, especially the elderly, disabled, or orphaned. However, demand often exceeded supply, and aid was uneven. Monasteries and religious houses provided shelter, food, and care for some of the poor. These institutions acted as hospitals, hospices, and refuges, though access was restricted and conditions were basic. Religious festivals marked important breaks in routine. Feast days offered additional food, music, and celebration. For the poor, these moments of abundance stood out sharply against daily scarcity. Community celebrations reinforced social bonds. Dancing, storytelling, and shared meals provided brief relief from labor and worry. These events helped sustain morale in difficult conditions. Markets were another focal point of community life. Poor people gathered to buy, sell, trade, and work. Markets offered opportunities for temporary labor, information exchange, and social interaction. However, markets also highlighted inequality. The poor saw goods they could not afford and wealth they could not access. This contrast reinforced social divisions without offering solutions. Justice within communities was uneven. Local courts and lords enforced laws that favored the wealthy. The poor were more likely to be punished harshly and less able to defend themselves. Public punishment was common and served as both deterrent and entertainment. Fines, physical punishment, and public humiliation affected the poor disproportionately, as they lacked resources to avoid penalties. Crime among the poor was often driven by necessity rather than malice. Theft of food, fuel, or tools occurred during periods of scarcity. Punishments for these crimes were severe by modern standards. Despite hardship, informal rules governed behavior. Sharing, cooperation, and restraint helped maintain stability. Excessive conflict threatened survival for everyone involved. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion. Strangers represented uncertainty and potential danger. Poor travelers, beggars, and migrants often faced hostility unless they could prove usefulness or affiliation. Beggars occupied a visible place in medieval communities. Some were disabled or elderly, others victims of misfortune. Begging was tolerated, but regulated and often stigmatized. Community identity was strong. People defined themselves by village, parish, and occupation rather than nation or ideology. This localized identity shaped loyalty and belonging. Disputes were common, but rarely abstract. Arguments involved land use, labor obligations, debts, and personal behavior. Resolution was often informal, enforced through social pressure rather than law. Shame and honor mattered deeply. Being seen as lazy, dishonest, or disruptive could result in exclusion. For the poor, exclusion could be fatal. Despite all this, community life provided meaning. Shared suffering created solidarity, and familiar faces offered comfort. People endured not alone, but surrounded by others facing the same conditions. Religion reinforced acceptance of hardship while offering hope beyond life. Heaven promised reward where earth did not. This belief shaped endurance rather than resistance. Life beyond the household was restrictive, demanding, and unequal, but it also provided structure in a world with few guarantees. For the poor, community and religion were not optional aspects of life. They were frameworks that made survival possible, even when resources were scarce. For the poor in the Middle Ages, power was something distant, heavy, and unavoidable. Authority shaped daily life in countless ways, yet it was rarely visible as a single figure or office. Instead, it existed as a network of obligations, rules, customs, and expectations that governed behavior from birth to death. Most poor people lived under the authority of a lord. This lord might be a noble, a knight, a bishop, or an institution such as a monastery. Regardless of who held power, the relationship was unequal. The poor provided labor, crops, and loyalty, while protection and justice were promised, though not always delivered. Land was the foundation of power. Poor families rarely owned the land they worked. Instead, they held the right to farm it in exchange for rent, labor, or a share of their harvest. This arrangement tied people to specific plots and limited their freedom to leave. These obligations were fixed, even when circumstances were not. A poor harvest did not reduce what was owed. Illness did not excuse labor. Failure to meet obligations could result in fines, loss of land, or physical punishment. Law was local and inconsistent. Rules varied from place to place and were enforced by those with authority rather than neutral institutions. What was acceptable in one village might be punished in another. For the poor, the legal system was intimidating and difficult to navigate. Court proceedings were expensive, slow, and often biased toward the wealthy. Legal knowledge was limited, and representation was rare. Punishments were harsh and public. Fines were common, but for the poor, fines were devastating. When money could not be paid, physical punishment followed. Whipping, time in stocks, or public humiliation were frequent penalties. Public punishment served as a warning to others. It reinforced social order by making examples of those who broke rules, even when those rules were unclear or unfair. Shame was a powerful tool of control. Crimes committed by the poor were often crimes of necessity. Theft of food, fuel, or tools occurred during periods of hunger or desperation. These acts were punished severely, despite being driven by survival rather than malice. Violence by the powerful was treated differently. Lords, officials, and soldiers often escaped serious punishment for actions that would ruin a poor person. Justice was not blind, and everyone understood this. The church played a dual role in authority. It offered spiritual guidance and charity, but it also reinforced obedience. Religious teachings emphasized acceptance of one's place in society and obedience to those in power. Disobedience was framed as both a legal and moral failing. Challenging authority was risky and rarely successful. Rebellion did occur, but it was dangerous and often ended in brutal suppression. Taxes were another burden on the poor. These took many forms, including money, goods, and labor. Special taxes were imposed during wars, royal events, or church campaigns, often pushing families to the edge of survival. Military obligations affected the poor indirectly and directly. Wars disrupted trade, destroyed crops, and displaced communities. Poor men were sometimes conscripted or forced to support armies with supplies. Soldiers passing through villages often took food, animals, and shelter without compensation. Resistance was dangerous, and complaints were rarely heard. Movement was restricted. Poor people needed permission to leave land, marry outside their village, or change occupations. Freedom of movement, taken for granted today, was limited and conditional. Vagrancy laws punished those without fixed homes or employment. Travelers, migrants, and beggars were viewed with suspicion and often faced arrest, punishment, or expulsion. Despite these restrictions, authority was not absolute. Lords relied on the labor of the poor and could not push endlessly without risking unrest. Custom and tradition placed limits on exploitation. Though these limits were flexible, local communities sometimes resisted quietly. People delayed work, hid resources, or interpreted obligations loosely when possible. These small acts of resistance allowed survival without open conflict. Formal rebellion was rare but memorable. Peasant uprisings occurred when pressure became unbearable, often triggered by new taxes or abuses of power. These uprisings were usually crushed, and consequences were severe. Fear shaped behavior: fear of punishment, fear of authority, and fear of standing out encouraged conformity. For the poor, safety often meant invisibility. Yet authority also provided structure. Laws, however unequal, created predictability. Knowing expectations, even harsh ones, allowed people to plan survival strategies. Power was experienced daily in subtle ways, in how land was divided, how disputes were settled, and how obligations were enforced. It was felt in decisions others made on behalf of the poor. For most, Authority was something endured rather than challenged. Life was lived within limits that could not be escaped, only navigated carefully. Understanding medieval poverty means understanding this imbalance. Survival required not only physical labor, but careful obedience and awareness of power, and even then, security was fragile. For the poor in the Middle Ages, old age was never guaranteed. Many people did not live long enough to experience it, and those who did often reached it already worn down by decades of physical labor, illness, and hunger. Aging was not a gradual transition into rest, but a slow loss of strength in a world that still demanded work. The body bore the marks of survival. Joints stiffened from years of repetitive labor. Backs curved under the weight of tools and loads carried since childhood. Teeth were often missing or painful, and eyesight faded without correction. Pain was constant, but accepted. There was no concept of retirement. As long as a person could contribute, they were expected to do so. Older men worked lighter tasks when possible, while older women continued household labor for as long as their bodies allowed. Rest came only when work was no longer physically possible. Those who could no longer work relied entirely on family or community support. Children, if they survived and remained nearby, became caregivers. Without family, survival depended on charity, begging, or institutional aid from religious houses. Elderly poverty was extreme. Without savings or pensions, many older people lived on the edge of hunger. Illness worsened this vulnerability, and medical care remained limited regardless of age. Respect for elders existed, but it did not guarantee comfort or security. Survival needs often outweighed sentiment. Families struggling to feed themselves faced difficult choices. Death was a familiar presence throughout life, not a distant event postponed by medicine. Poor people saw death regularly among neighbors, family members, and children. It shaped attitudes toward life and loss. Most deaths occurred at home. There were no hospitals for the dying, and few people traveled far when illness worsened. Death came quietly, often in crowded rooms, surrounded by daily life rather than ceremony. The dying were typically attended by family, neighbors, or clergy when available. Prayers were said, confessions made, and final instructions given. Death was both a personal and communal event. Fear of death was balanced by religious belief. Heaven promised rest, reward, and justice absent in life. Hell offered warning and meaning. These beliefs helped people accept suffering and finality. Burials were simple for the poor. Graves were shallow and unmarked, often reused over time. Wooden markers decayed quickly, and many resting places were forgotten within generations. Funerals were modest affairs. Neighbors attended, prayers were spoken, and life resumed quickly. Extended mourning was a luxury few could afford. Legacy was not measured in possessions or records. It existed in memory, in skills passed down, and in children who continued the same cycle of labor and survival. The poor left little behind because they had little to give. Tools, clothing, and household items were reused or inherited. Nothing was wasted, even in death. Life expectancy statistics hide a complex reality. Those who survived childhood might live into their 40s or 50s, but few reached old age without significant disability. Death was often preceded by years of decline. Despite hardship, death was not always feared. For some, it represented relief from pain, hunger, and exhaustion. The afterlife promised what the world did not. Looking back, poverty in the Middle Ages was not dramatic in the way stories often suggest. It was quiet, repetitive, and exhausting. Survival was a daily achievement rather than a heroic struggle. People did not think of themselves as historical subjects. They lived ordinary lives shaped by necessity, tradition, and limited choice. Their experiences were rarely recorded, yet they formed the foundation of medieval society. The castles, churches, and kingdoms remembered today were built on the labor of the poor. Their lives sustained the structures that outlasted them, even as their names faded. Understanding what it was really like to be poor in the Middle Ages means recognizing this quiet endurance. It means seeing history not as a series of grand events, but as millions of ordinary days lived under difficult conditions. These lives were not defined by misery alone. There were moments of laughter, connection, faith, and meaning, but comfort was rare and security was fragile. As this story comes to a close, it leaves behind not heroes or villains, but people who worked, suffered, adapted, and endured. Their world was harsh, but it was real, and for most who lived in it, survival itself was the greatest achievement. For the poor in the Middle Ages, religion was not something reserved for special occasions or private reflection. It was woven into daily life so completely that it shaped how people understood hunger, illness, work, and even their own thoughts. Faith was not optional. It was the framework through which the world made sense. Most poor people did not question the existence of God. Doubt, as we understand it today, was rare and dangerous. The world around them appeared unpredictable and harsh, and religion offered explanations where practical answers were unavailable. God was present in every aspect of life. Good harvests were blessings, failed crops were punishment or testing. Illness was a trial, a correction, or a mystery beyond human understanding. Nothing happened without spiritual meaning. Church bells structured time more reliably than clocks. They signaled when to work, when to rest, when to pray, and when to gather. Even those who could not attend services regularly lived according to the rhythms created by the church. For the poor, prayer was practical. People prayed for rain, for healing, for protection, and for survival. These prayers were often simple, repeated daily, and learned by memory rather than reading. Most people could not read religious texts. Scripture was encountered through sermons, images, and rituals rather than books. Painted walls, carved figures, and stained glass communicated religious stories visually to those who could not access written words. The church interior offered a different world from daily life. Stone walls, candlelight, and quiet created a sense of order and permanence absent from poor households. Entering a church meant stepping briefly into a space that felt protected and meaningful. Confession was a regular practice. People examined their behavior not just in moral terms, but in practical ones. Illness, misfortune, or loss could be interpreted as the result of unconfessed sin. Fear played a role in belief. Hell was vividly described in sermons and imagery, reminding people of consequences beyond earthly suffering. For those already living difficult lives, fear of eternal punishment reinforced obedience and restraint. At the same time, heaven offered hope. It promised rest, fairness, and reward denied in life. For the poor, this promise gave meaning to endurance and sacrifice. Religious fasting affected daily survival. On fasting days, meat and animal products were forbidden, limiting already scarce food options. While these rules applied to everyone, the poor felt their impact more strongly. Saints played an important role in everyday belief. People prayed to specific saints for healing, protection, or success in work. Saints were seen as intermediaries who understood human suffering more closely than God himself. Pilgrimages were known to the poor, but rarely accessible. Travel was costly and dangerous. Most people expressed devotion locally through shrines, relics, and holy days. Charity was framed as religious duty. Giving alms was encouraged, especially during religious seasons. For the poor, this meant occasional assistance, though rarely enough to provide lasting security. Religious holidays provided rare breaks from routine. Feast days brought additional food, drink, and social gathering. These moments of abundance stood out sharply against daily scarcity. Fear of divine judgment shaped behavior. Stealing, lying, or disobedience carried not only legal risk, but spiritual consequence. This reinforced social order in a way laws alone could not. Death was understood through faith. Dying well, with confession and prayer, mattered deeply. A sudden death without spiritual preparation was feared more than death itself. Grief was managed through belief. Loss was explained as God's will, easing emotional burden by placing responsibility beyond human control. For the poor, religion did not remove suffering, but it explained it. It offered structure where life was chaotic and meaning where circumstances felt unfair. Faith also reinforced inequality. Social hierarchy was presented as part of divine order. Poverty was not framed as injustice, but as a condition to be endured with humility. Despite this, belief offered genuine comfort. It allowed people to imagine a world beyond labor and hunger, where endurance had purpose. Religion was not distant or abstract. It shaped how people woke, worked, feared, and hoped. It lived in gestures, habits, and expectations rather than theology. For the poor, faith was not about salvation alone. It was about surviving the present while believing the future held something better. And then even as belief provided structure, it also left questions unanswered. For the poor in the Middle Ages, fear was not something that arrived suddenly. It was always present, moving quietly beneath daily life, shaping thoughts, habits, and decisions. It did not announce itself loudly. Instead, it settled in slowly, becoming part of how the world was understood. Life was uncertain in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Illness appeared without warning. Crops failed without explanation. Children became sick and died within days. Accidents happened suddenly and without mercy. When no clear reason could be found, people looked elsewhere for answers. Religion explained much, but not everything. Faith offered comfort and structure, but it did not fully explain why suffering fell unevenly, why one family survived while another did not, or why misfortune returned again and again to the same people. In these gaps, superstition grew. Superstition was not separate from everyday life. It was woven into routine, tradition, and survival. For the poor, it was not foolishness. It was a way of making sense of a world that offered very little control. Many believed the world was crowded with unseen forces. Spirits, demons, restless souls, and wandering presences were thought to exist alongside the living. These forces were not always hostile, but they were unpredictable, and unpredictability itself inspired fear. Darkness was especially troubling. Night was not simply the absence of daylight. It was a time when labor stopped, sounds changed, and familiar shapes disappeared. With no artificial light beyond candles or fire, shadows stretched and moved, making ordinary spaces feel unfamiliar. Strange sounds were rarely ignored. A noise outside could be an animal, but it could also be something else. The uncertainty mattered more than the answer. Once doubt entered the mind, fear followed. Certain places were avoided whenever possible. Forest edges, crossroads, abandoned buildings, and graveyards were believed to be dangerous, especially after sunset. These locations were thought to exist between worlds, neither fully safe nor entirely natural. Crossroads, in particular, carried symbolic weight. They were places of choice, transition, and vulnerability. Executions and burials of the disgraced were sometimes performed there, reinforcing the idea that such places attracted restless spirits. Illness inspired some of the deepest fears. Sudden sickness was often blamed on supernatural causes. A fever that appeared overnight, or a child who weakened rapidly was rarely viewed as random. Something unseen was thought to be responsible. Curses, evil spirits, and the evil eye were common explanations. When remedies failed, spiritual explanations felt more believable than admitting helplessness. At least belief offered a reason, even if it offered no cure. Protective practices became part of daily life. Charms were worn on the body, symbols were carved into doorframes, certain prayers were repeated daily, not only for devotion, but for safety. These actions created a sense of control, even when circumstances remained unchanged. Children learned fear early. Stories told to warn them away from danger also taught them that the world was filled with hidden threats. These stories stayed with them into adulthood, shaping instincts and reactions long after childhood ended. Weather carried meaning beyond survival. Storms, droughts, and strange skies were interpreted as messages or warnings. A sudden frost or an unseasonal heat wave could provoke fear far greater than its immediate damage. Animals were often seen as signs. An owl near a home, a dog howling at night, or livestock behaving strangely could be interpreted as omens. These interpretations spread quickly, reinforcing collective anxiety. Death did not end fear. Many believed the dead could linger, especially if burial rites were rushed, improper, or denied. Ghost stories were not entertainment. They were explanations for unresolved grief and unexplained events. Poor burial conditions worsened these fears. Overcrowded graveyards, reused ground, and shallow graves created anxiety that the dead might not rest peacefully. Unmarked graves made remembrance uncertain, which itself felt dangerous. Witchcraft beliefs were widespread and deeply feared. When misfortune repeated itself, someone was often blamed. The poor were especially vulnerable, particularly elderly women, widows, and those who lived alone. Suspicion required little evidence. Rumors spread quickly in close communities, and fear amplified them. Once accused, defending oneself was nearly impossible without wealth or social power. Fear shaped behavior quietly. People avoided standing out. They avoided conflict. They avoided drawing attention. Survival often depended on remaining unnoticed. Objects carried symbolic meaning. Certain plants were protective, others were dangerous. Knowledge of these beliefs was passed down through generations, becoming part of cultural memory. Time of day mattered deeply. Night was feared not only because of darkness, but because vigilance was harder to maintain. Sleep itself could feel dangerous, as it required surrendering awareness. Dreams were taken seriously. Nightmares were interpreted as warnings, messages, or signs. Dreams were remembered, discussed, and sometimes acted upon. Children often slept close to adults, partly for warmth and partly for protection. Fear of the dark was not something people outgrew. It simply became managed. Despite constant anxiety, life continued. People learned to live with fear rather than eliminate it. Fear became background noise, always present, but rarely acknowledged directly. Superstition offered structure where reason failed. Rituals and beliefs created patterns that made chaos feel manageable. Even clergy shared many of these beliefs. Superstition was not limited to the uneducated. Poverty simply made its consequences harsher. Fear also strengthened community bonds. Shared beliefs created shared understanding. When everyone feared the same things, no one felt entirely alone. At the same time, fear limited freedom. Curiosity was dangerous. Questioning accepted explanations could attract suspicion. The unseen world shaped daily choices as much as hunger or labor. It influenced travel, sleep, and interpretation of events. For the poor, fear was not dramatic terror. It was careful living, quiet restraint, constant awareness that not everything could be seen or understood. This invisible pressure weighed heavily on lives already filled with hardship. Endurance required not just strength, but emotional control. And while superstition filled many gaps, it could not protect against everything. For the poor in the Middle Ages, war was not an event that arrived suddenly and left just as quickly. It was something that lingered, returned, and reshaped daily life long after armies passed through. Even in times of peace, the possibility of conflict was never far away. Wars were frequent, overlapping, and often unresolved. Kingdoms fought over borders, succession, religion, and honor, but for the poor, the reasons mattered little. What mattered were the consequences. War did not begin on the battlefield for ordinary people. It began with rumors, stories carried by travelers, whispers at markets, strange movements of soldiers on distant roads. These rumors brought unease long before violence arrived. People listened carefully for signs, a lord calling for supplies, increased taxes, orders to provide labor or shelter. These were early warnings that hardship was approaching. When armies moved, they rarely carried enough food. Soldiers were expected to live off the land. This meant villages, farms, and towns paid the price. Fields were trampled, crops were taken or destroyed, livestock was seized, grain stores were emptied. Even when payment was promised, it was rarely given. For the poor, losing food meant losing survival. There were no reserves, no savings, no alternative supply. One lost harvest could mean starvation. Homes were not safe. Soldiers needed shelter, and refusal was dangerous. Families were forced to house armed men, surrendering privacy and security. Violence did not always involve battle. Threats, intimidation, and punishment were common. Resistance could result in beatings or worse. Women and children were especially vulnerable. Protection depended on chance, not law. Many suffered silently, knowing there was little recourse. War disrupted work. Fields went untended. Tools were stolen or broken. Labor stopped not because people chose to rest, but because survival routines were shattered. Markets collapsed. Trade routes became unsafe. Prices rose sharply. Food that remained became unaffordable. Disease followed armies closely. Crowded camps, poor sanitation, and movement between regions spread illness rapidly. The poor, already weakened, were hit hardest. In many cases, more people died from disease and starvation than from fighting itself. Taxes increased during wartime. Lords demanded more to fund campaigns. Payment was enforced harshly, even when people had nothing left to give. Failure to pay could mean loss of land, imprisonment, or forced labor. Poverty deepened quickly. Some were conscripted. Poor men were pressed into service, often with little training or equipment. Survival rates were low. Those who returned were often injured, traumatized, or unable to work. Their families bore the burden. War also created refugees. Families fled burned villages and unsafe regions, carrying what little they could. Many never returned. Displacement destroyed community ties. People became strangers, dependent on charity that was scarce even in stable times. Begging increased during wars. Roads filled with the hungry and displaced. Authorities often responded with punishment rather than aid. Fear became constant, not abstract fear, but immediate awareness that safety could vanish overnight. Nighttime brought particular anxiety. Fires were extinguished to avoid detection. Silence was enforced. Sleep came lightly, if at all. Children grew up quickly during wartime. They learned to hide, remain quiet, and obey without question. Religious interpretation intensified. War was seen as punishment, trial, or divine will. This belief brought comfort to some and despair to others. Churches sometimes offered refuge, but they too were targeted. Sacred spaces were not always respected. Memory of war lingered long after fighting stopped. Fields took years to recover. Population loss meant fewer hands to work. Communities changed permanently. Some villages never recovered. Others rebuilt slowly, with fewer people and less hope. For the poor, war was not heroic. It was hunger, fear, loss, and exhaustion. It reshaped lives quietly, leaving marks that lasted generations. And even when peace was declared, poverty did not lift. It settled deeper, shaped by what war had taken and never returned. For the poor in the Middle Ages, winter was not simply a season. It was a trial that arrived every year, testing bodies, homes, and spirits. Long before the first snow fell, winter already shaped daily thought. Cold was feared not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was deadly. Once winter arrived, options disappeared. Food became scarce. Work slowed or stopped. Travel grew dangerous. Preparation was everything. Yet preparation was often impossible. Poor families entered winter with what they had managed to store. If the harvest had been weak, winter began with anxiety. If it had failed entirely, winter meant hunger from the start. Food storage was basic and unreliable. Grain was kept in sacks or bins that attracted rodents. Dried meat spoiled easily. Vegetables rotted or froze. Losses were expected and accepted. Meals grew smaller as winter progressed. Portions were stretched. Bread was mixed with fillers. Soup became thinner. Hunger was managed quietly. Children learned not to ask for more. Fuel was as important as food. Firewood had to be gathered months in advance. Those without access to forests burned whatever they could find. Scraps, dried dung, broken furniture. Fires were kept small. Warmth was rationed. Rooms went unheated to save fuel. People clustered together at night to share body heat. Homes offered little protection. Walls were thin. Roofs leaked. Wind crept through cracks. Frost formed inside living spaces. Sleeping was difficult. Cold seeped into bones. Blankets were heavy but insufficient. Waking during the night was common, not from noise, but from discomfort. Illness spread easily in winter. Crowded living conditions and weakened bodies created perfect conditions for disease. A simple cold could become fatal. Medical help was scarce. Travel to seek aid was often impossible in bad weather. Many simply waited and endured. Children and the elderly suffered most. Small bodies lost heat quickly. Older bodies struggled to recover from illness. Winter also brought isolation. Roads became impassable. Villages were cut off. News stopped arriving. The world felt smaller and quieter. Darkness dominated daily life. Short days limited work hours. Candles and lamps were expensive, so evenings were long and dim. Time moved slowly. Without work, days blended together. Idleness was not restful. It was anxious waiting. Stories were told more often in winter, not always for entertainment, but to pass time and distract from hunger and cold. These stories carried lessons, warnings, and shared fears. Religion played a stronger role during winter months. Prayer offered structure when days felt endless. Church gatherings provided warmth, both physical and social. Yet winter also deepened inequality. The wealthy stayed warm and fed. The poor endured quietly, watching abundance exist just beyond reach. Some turned to begging during winter. This was dangerous. Authorities often punished vagrancy, seeing it as moral failure rather than desperation. Others stole food or fuel. Punishment could be severe, but hunger outweighed fear. Death was common in winter. It came quietly, often at night. Families woke to find someone gone, the cold having taken what hunger weakened. Burials were difficult. Frozen ground delayed funerals. Bodies were stored until thaw. This added emotional strain to already exhausted families. Despite everything, people endured. Winter survival was not dramatic heroism. It was persistence, getting through one day, then the next. Small comforts mattered. a shared fire, a warm drink, a moment of laughter. These things carried people forward. When spring finally arrived, it did not erase winter's damage. Bodies were weakened, supplies were gone, recovery was slow. Winter left marks that lasted beyond the season. Meant hunger would arrive early and stay long. For the poor, there was rarely enough surplus to truly prepare. What little could be stored was fragile, vulnerable to rot, pests, and theft. Grain was the most valuable resource. It was dried and stored in sacks or bins, often inside the home. Rats and mice were a constant threat. Families expected losses and accepted them as unavoidable. Mold ruined what damp air touched. When supplies spoiled, there was no replacement. Bread became smaller as winter progressed. Flour was stretched with whatever could be mixed into it: ground peas, roots, even bark in extreme cases. The taste was unpleasant, but survival mattered more than comfort. Meals followed a pattern of reduction. What began as modest portions became thin soups and watered stews. Eventually, meals were skipped entirely. Hunger became familiar, a dull ache rather than a sharp pain. Children learned to eat slowly. They learned not to complain. Hunger was not discussed openly, but everyone felt it. Fuel was nearly as important as food. Fire meant warmth, cooking, and light. Wood had to be gathered before winter, but access was limited. Forests were often owned by lords, and collecting wood without permission was punishable. Those without access burned what they could find: broken furniture, old tools, dried animal dung, twisted grasses. Anything that would burn was saved. Fires were kept small. Rooms were closed off to preserve heat. Families crowded into a single space, sharing warmth through proximity. Homes offered little protection. Walls were thin, often made of wood, mud, or stone, without insulation. Wind slipped through gaps. Snow found its way inside. Frost formed on interior walls. Sleeping was uncomfortable and often painful. Blankets were heavy, but insufficient. Straw mattresses offered little insulation. People slept fully clothed, sometimes wrapped together for warmth. Illness thrived in these conditions. Cold weakened bodies, already strained by hunger. Coughs lingered. Fevers spread quickly in close quarters. Medical care was almost non-existent in winter. Roads were impassable. Travel was dangerous. Many illnesses were simply endured. Children were especially vulnerable. Small bodies lost heat quickly. Many did not survive their first winters. Death was common enough to feel expected, though never easy. The elderly suffered quietly. Weakness increased. Recovery slowed. Many died during winter months, not from a single cause, but from accumulated hardship. Winter brought isolation. Roads disappeared under snow and mud. Villages became cut off. News stopped arriving. The world narrowed to familiar faces and familiar fears. Darkness dominated daily life. Short days, limited work. Candles were expensive, so light was rationed. Evenings were long and quiet. Time moved differently in winter. Without work, days blurred together. Waiting became a form of labor. Waiting for spring, waiting for warmth, waiting for hunger to ease. Stories were told more often, not always for entertainment. Stories passed time, preserved memory, and explained suffering. Many carried warnings about greed, waste, or divine punishment. Religion became more central during winter. Prayer offered structure when routine collapsed. Church gatherings provided warmth and a sense of shared endurance. Yet winter also exposed inequality clearly. Wealthier households remained warm and fed. The poor watched abundance exist nearby. Unreachable, some turned to begging during winter. This was dangerous. Authorities viewed begging as disorder. Punishments included whipping, imprisonment, or forced labor. Others stole food or fuel. Hunger outweighed fear of punishment. Many accepted the risk as necessary. Death was frequent in winter, often quiet. People passed during the night, the cold finishing what hunger began. Families discovered losses in the morning. Burials were difficult. Frozen ground delayed funerals. Bodies were stored until thaw. This prolonged grief and deepened fear of unrested souls. Despite everything, people endured. Survival was not heroic. It was persistent, one day at a time, one meal at a time. Small comforts mattered: a shared fire, a warm drink, a familiar voice. These moments carried people through the darkest months. When spring finally came, it did not erase winter's damage. Bodies were weakened, supplies were gone. Recovery was slow and uncertain. Winter left marks that lasted beyond the season. It shaped health, memory, and expectation. And once winter ended, people immediately began preparing for the next one. In the next part, we'll look at how poverty intersected with crime, punishment, and public shame, where survival often collided with the law. For the poor in the Middle Ages, the law was not something distant or abstract. It was present in daily life, shaping behavior through fear rather than protection. Laws existed primarily to preserve order and property, not to ensure fairness. Survival often placed the poor in direct conflict with these laws. Hunger pushed people toward theft. Cold pushed them toward trespass. Desperation forced choices that were illegal, even when they were necessary. Stealing food was one of the most common crimes. Bread, grain, cheese, and firewood were taken quietly whenever possible. These were not acts of rebellion, but acts of endurance. The law made little distinction between need and intent. Theft was theft, regardless of circumstance. Punishment followed swiftly and publicly. Public punishment was a central feature of medieval justice. It was designed not to rehabilitate, but to shame, intimidate, and deter. Stocks and pillories were common in towns and villages. Offenders were restrained in public spaces, exposed to weather, ridicule, and abuse. Passers-by threw refuse, shouted insults, or struck them. Shame was part of the sentence. For the poor, public humiliation could be more damaging than physical pain. Reputation mattered. Being marked as a criminal could destroy future survival chances. Fines were often imposed, but fines punished the poor more severely than the wealthy. Those who could not pay faced imprisonment or further punishment. Prisons were not places of correction. They were holding spaces, cold, dark, and overcrowded. They spread disease and despair. Many died awaiting trial. Corporal punishment was common. Whipping, branding, and mutilation were used to mark offenders permanently. These marks followed people for life. Repeat offenders faced harsher penalties. Poverty itself increased the likelihood of repeat offenses, creating a cycle that was difficult to escape. Begging was often criminalized. Authorities viewed beggars as threats to order rather than people in need. Laws restricted movement, forcing the poor to remain in their place of birth. Those found wandering without permission could be arrested, beaten, or expelled. Women faced unique risks. Crimes related to morality were enforced more harshly against them. Accusations of prostitution or disorderly behavior carried severe consequences. Children were not exempt from punishment. Young offenders were subjected to the same public penalties as adults, reinforcing fear early in life. Justice was inconsistent. Local lords, magistrates, or councils enforced laws differently. Outcomes depended heavily on status, connections, and reputation. The wealthy often escaped punishment through payment or influence. The poor had no such protection. Public executions were meant to be instructional. Hanging, beheading, and burning were performed openly. Crowds gathered. Children watched. Executions reinforced the power of authority and the consequences of defiance. Yet crime did not disappear. Need outweighed fear. Hunger returned, cold returned, laws did not feed people. Some communities showed quiet mercy. Neighbors turned away. Officials delayed enforcement. Compassion existed, but it was fragile. Others enforced laws harshly, believing cruelty preserved order, shame extended beyond punishment. Families of offenders were stigmatized. Children inherited reputations they did not earn. This social marking limited marriage prospects, employment, and aid. Despite fear, people adapted. They learned which rules were enforced strictly and which could be bent. Survival required awareness, not defiance. The poor lived with constant awareness of authority. Every action carried risk. Crime was not an identity, it was a response. Punishment was not justice, it was control. And through it all, survival remained the priority. Punishment did not end when a sentence was carried out. For the poor, its effects lingered long afterward. A whipping healed slowly. A branded mark never faded. A public accusation stayed in memory even when innocence was claimed. Many who were punished found themselves unable to return to ordinary life. Employers avoided them. Neighbors distrusted them. Charity was withheld, not because need disappeared, but because reputation had been damaged. This created a quiet trap. Once punished, survival became harder, and when survival became harder, crime became more likely. Authorities were aware of this cycle, but rarely attempted to break it. Law existed to preserve order, not to address causes. Hunger was treated as moral failure. Poverty was seen as evidence of weakness or sin. Courts were informal by modern standards. Trials were brief. Evidence was limited. Testimony depended heavily on social standing. A poor person's word carried little weight against that of a landowner or official. False accusations were common. Personal grudges, envy, or fear could easily become legal action. Once accused, defending oneself required witnesses, time, and money, things the poor rarely possessed. Confessions were often coerced. Fear of harsher punishment pushed many to admit guilt, even when innocent. Once confessed, the path forward was fixed. Punishments varied by region, but severity was consistent. Justice was meant to be visible and memorable. Pain served as warning to others. Public shame was especially powerful in small communities. Everyone knew everyone. A single punishment could define a person's identity permanently. Children of the punished suffered alongside them. They were avoided, mocked, or denied opportunity. Poverty spread through families, reinforced by memory. Some crimes carried spiritual consequences as well. Church authorities could impose penance, public confession, or exclusion from religious life. This deepened isolation. Being barred from church meant losing not only spiritual comfort, but community support. In many villages, the church was the center of social life. Women accused of crimes faced additional scrutiny. Their morality was judged alongside their actions. Even minor offenses could result in lifelong suspicion. Widows and unmarried women were particularly vulnerable. Without male protection, they were easier targets for accusation and blame. Despite this, many communities practiced quiet resistance. Neighbors warned each other of inspections. Food was shared secretly. Witnesses lied to protect one another. This informal solidarity was fragile. Fear often overpowered loyalty, especially when authorities threatened collective punishment. During times of famine or unrest, punishment intensified. Authorities feared disorder more than suffering. Laws were enforced harshly to prevent unrest. Executions increased during crises. Public death was meant to restore control. Crowds gathered, not always willingly, but because absence could be noticed. For the poor, witnessing punishment reinforced a constant lesson. Survival required obedience, caution, and silence. Yet even under these conditions, people found ways to endure. They memorized routines. They learned when to speak, and when to remain quiet. They watched authority carefully. Crime was not romantic. It was exhausting, dangerous, and humiliating. But when hunger returned, the law became secondary. Justice was not blind. It looked directly at status, and for the poor, it rarely looked kindly. As hardship continued, many realized survival within their community was no longer possible. Movement became the next choice, and that movement reshaped lives entirely. For many of the poor in the Middle Ages, there came a point when staying was no longer possible. Hunger, punishment, loss of work, or destruction from war forced a decision that carried its own dangers. Leaving home was not seen as opportunity, it was a last resort. Migration was rarely planned, it happened gradually, through necessity rather than choice. A failed harvest, a fine that could not be paid, a reputation damaged beyond repair. Each pushed people closer to the road. Leaving meant abandoning familiarity. The poor relied heavily on knowledge of their surroundings, knowing where to gather fuel, which fields allowed gleaning, which neighbors might help in times of need. Once gone, this knowledge became useless. Travel was slow and exhausting. Most moved on foot, carrying what little they owned. Clothing, tools, and food were bundled together. Many owned no proper footwear. Long distances were walked barefoot or in worn shoes that offered little protection. Roads were dangerous. They were poorly maintained and often a little more than dirt paths. Mud, ruts, and standing water made travel difficult, especially in bad weather. Inns were rare and expensive. Poor travelers slept outdoors, in barns, abandoned buildings, or under trees. Exposure to cold and rain weakened already strained bodies. Food was uncertain. Travelers relied on begging, scavenging, or occasional charity. Some carried small items to trade. Others depended entirely on kindness. Begging was common, but dangerous. Authorities viewed it as disorderly and suspicious. Laws restricted who could beg and where. Many areas required permits or proof of local origin. Those caught begging without permission faced punishment. Whipping, imprisonment, or forced labor were common. Yet people continued to beg because hunger left no alternative. Begging itself followed unspoken rules. Travelers learned where to ask and where to avoid. Churches were common places to seek charity. Markets offered opportunities, but also scrutiny. Appearance mattered. The sick, elderly, and disabled received more sympathy. Able-bodied beggars were treated with suspicion or hostility. Some mutilated themselves intentionally to gain sympathy. This desperate act reflected how severe survival pressures could become. Families often traveled together, especially after displacement. Children walked long distances, carrying burdens far beyond their years. Many became exhausted or ill. Others traveled alone. Orphans, widows, and the elderly were common on the roads. Isolation increased vulnerability. Disease spread easily among travelers. Crowded sleeping spaces and shared food accelerated illness. Many died far from home, unnamed and unrecorded. Migration broke community ties. Names, histories, and reputations disappeared. This offered freedom for some, anonymity for others. Without community memory, people were judged solely by appearance. Trust was rare. Suspicion was constant. Authorities feared wandering populations. Migrants were blamed for crime, disease, and unrest. Laws grew stricter over time. Some regions expelled migrants immediately. Others forced them into labor. Very few offered lasting refuge. Despite danger, movement continued. People followed rumors of work, food, or safety. These rumors were often false, but hope was necessary. Seasonal migration became common. Some traveled during warmer months and returned when possible. Others never found a place to settle again. Children raised on the road grew up differently. They learned survival skills early. They learned silence, caution, and adaptation. Yet even in movement, communities sometimes formed. Groups traveled together for safety. Shared hardship created temporary bonds. Songs, stories, and shared meals helped pass long journeys. These moments were brief but meaningful. Not all migration was forced. Some chose movement over submission. The road, though dangerous, offered autonomy absent in controlled communities. Still, life on the road was rarely sustainable long term. Bodies weakened, supplies vanished, the search for stability continued. For many, migration ended in new forms of poverty rather than escape from it. And as people moved, poverty spread beyond villages into roads, towns, and borders. For the poor in the Middle Ages, suffering was not only physical. Hunger, cold, and labor shaped the body, but over time they also shaped the mind. Mental strain was constant, though rarely named or understood in the way it is today. There was no language for exhaustion of the spirit, no concept of mental health. Feelings of despair, anxiety, or hopelessness were simply part of life, expected and endured. Loneliness was common, even within families. Long hours of labor left little room for conversation. Fatigue silenced people. Survival came before reflection. Many lived surrounded by others, yet felt deeply isolated. Poverty created distance. Shame discouraged sharing hardship openly. Complaints were seen as weakness or ingratitude. Fear played a central role. Fear of hunger, fear of illness, fear of punishment, fear of the coming winter. These fears did not come and go. They stayed. Sleep offered little relief. Nights were restless. Hunger woke people. Cold interrupted rest. Dreams reflected daily anxieties, filled with images of loss, pursuit, or punishment. For some, despair settled slowly. It did not arrive as sudden collapse, but as quiet resignation. Hope narrowed, expectations shrank. The future became something to survive rather than imagine. Repetition intensified this strain. Each day resembled the last. Work followed routine. Meals were the same. Hardship offered the little variation. Time felt endless. Joy was not absent, but it was brief. Laughter existed, but rarely lingered. Moments of relief were treasured precisely because they were rare. Children absorbed this emotional environment early. They learned restraint, silence, and caution. Many matured quickly, carrying responsibilities long before adulthood. Grief was constant. Death was frequent. Children died. Parents died. Siblings disappeared through illness, migration, or war. Mourning had no extended space. Life did not pause for grief. Work continued. Survival demanded movement. Loss was folded into routine rather than processed. Some turned inward. Silence became a form of protection. Speaking less reduced risk. Emotional expression was dangerous when vulnerability invited judgment. Others turned outward, clinging to religion, ritual, or superstition. Prayer provided structure. Repetition offered comfort. Faith gave meaning where reason failed. Yet faith did not always relieve despair. Many believed suffering was deserved, that poverty reflected moral failure. This belief deepened shame. Isolation intensified during hardship. The poor lacked privacy, yet lacked intimacy. Confined spaces did not guarantee connection. Widows, migrants, and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Without strong social ties, loneliness became severe. Many lived their final years largely unseen. Mental collapse was rarely recognized as such. Those who withdrew completely, spoke incoherently, or behaved unpredictably were labeled mad, possessed, or cursed. Care was limited. Families managed as best they could. Some were abandoned, others were restrained or excluded. Suicide occurred, though it was rarely recorded openly. Religious condemnation discouraged discussion. Deaths were often attributed to illness or accident. Yet despair did not define everyone. Many adapted psychologically. They lowered expectations. They focused on immediate tasks. Survival itself became meaning, small routines helped. Repeating familiar actions created stability. Habit reduced anxiety when choice felt dangerous. Community rituals offered relief. Festivals, holy days, and gatherings broke monotony. Even brief moments of celebration restored emotional balance. Storytelling played a role. Stories allowed suffering to be framed, shared, and understood. They passed wisdom quietly. Humor existed, often dark and restrained. Laughter provided release, even in hardship. Despite relentless pressure, many endured. Mental resilience was not dramatic, it was quiet persistence. Yet the cost accumulated. Long term poverty reshaped personalities, expectations, and relationships. For many, hope was not a vision of change, but the belief that tomorrow might not be worse than today. And for those whose minds could no longer endure, society offered little refuge. For the poor in the Middle Ages, hope existed, but it was narrow and fragile. It did not resemble the idea of progress or upward movement as we understand it today. Instead, hope was measured in small changes, brief relief, and moments when suffering loosened its grip. Hope was rarely about transformation, it was about pause. A good harvest, after several bad years, could feel miraculous, not because it promised wealth, but because it meant survival without constant fear. Food security, even temporary, changed everything. During such times, meals grew slightly larger, bread tasted fuller, hunger receded into the background, bodies recovered slowly, and energy returned in small amounts. Seasonal work offered another form of hope. Harvests, construction projects, and market expansions created short term employment. Wages were low, but steady work mattered more than pay. These opportunities were temporary. When seasons changed, work disappeared, but even brief stability allowed debts to be settled, tools repaired, or clothing replaced. Charity sometimes offered relief. Churches distributed alms during holy seasons. Wealthy households gave food on feast days. These acts were limited, but meaningful. Receiving charity carried shame, but survival outweighed pride. Many accepted aid quietly, knowing it would not last. Festivals brought rare joy. Holy days interrupted routine. Music, food, and shared celebration created emotional relief. These moments reminded people of life beyond survival. Even the poorest participated in festivals, if only as observers. Laughter and movement briefly replaced fear and exhaustion. Marriage sometimes offered stability. Two households combined resources. Shared labor reduced an individual burden. Yet marriage also brought risk, especially for women. A supportive community could transform hardship. Neighbors shared food, watched children, and offered shelter during crisis. Mutual aid was essential. Not all communities provided this support. Some were harsh and suspicious, but where cooperation existed, survival improved. Apprenticeship offered rare mobility. A child placed with a skilled worker might learn a trade. This path was uncertain and often exploitative, but it offered possibility. Most apprenticeships favored boys. Girls had fewer options. Domestic service was one of the few paths available, offering food and shelter in exchange for labor. Service provided stability, but little autonomy. Abuse was common. Leaving meant returning to poverty. Religious life offered another alternative. Monasteries sometimes accepted the poor. In return, individuals gave up personal freedom. Life was structured, predictable, and physically demanding. For some, this was relief. Regular meals, shelter, and routine eased suffering. For others, it was confinement. Pilgrimage offered temporary escape. Travelers moved through different regions, supported by religious hospitality. The journey was dangerous, but it allowed movement without punishment. Pilgrimage also provided meaning. Suffering was reframed as devotion. Endurance became purpose. Occasionally, disaster created opportunity, population loss from plague or war, increased demand for labor, wages rose briefly, bargaining power shifted. These moments were rare and short lived. Authorities often intervened to control wages and movement. Still, during these brief windows, some escaped extreme poverty, not permanently, but enough to change circumstances. Hope also lived in belief. Faith promised reward beyond life. Suffering was given meaning through expectation of justice after death. This belief sustained many. It did not remove pain, but it allowed endurance. Parents placed hope in children. Education, apprenticeship, or marriage might offer them a better future. These hopes were uncertain, but persistent. Stories reinforced this hope. Tales of saints, miracles, and unexpected fortune circulated widely. They reminded people that change, though rare, was possible, yet hope was dangerous. Expectation invited disappointment. Many learned to keep hope small, controlled, and quiet. The poor balanced hope carefully. Too little hope led to despair. Too much led to suffering when reality returned. Most lived between these extremes, enduring, adapting, and waiting. Hope was not loud. It did not announce itself. It appeared in routine moments, a warm meal, a kind word, a stable week, and when hope faded, survival continued anyway.